One of the first impulses I had when I saw the theme that ORF has put to us today is that perhaps social protection in itself is a conversation much wider than bargaining. But be that as it may, I think there are, through this conversation, we will have the opportunity to apply many a lens on the theme. I think intrinsic to the theme is, for instance, the tussle between the old and the new. In many, many areas of the digital market, we see this tussle play out as far as regulations are concerned. And in particular, in terms of gig work, workers are doing work that they've been perhaps doing earlier, as is the case in perhaps Uber and many other models of gig work. The delivery of services or products is very similar to the traditional economy. So there's obviously an intrinsic desire to impose legacy regulations on the new economy in the gig economy context in particular, much more than perhaps in other elements or segments of the digital market. There is a frame that we can apply which is about whether we have the appropriate set of first principles to really cut through the clutter when we try to address this question of old and new. We have also another frame of, from the supply side, what incumbents may want versus new entrants, and I think there is no homogeneous answer to these questions. Similarly, on the levels of development that any particular country may be at, and the answer to this question of what is the appropriate level of social protection that should be provided, as Dr. Debroy is already situated in the Indian context. We have a lot of layers of this, of this onion to peel, and so I'm going to take the liberty to go around the table, so to speak, metaphorically, quicker than perhaps you're used to from the morning session onwards. And maybe Dr. Debroy, I can bring you in again just to follow up on some of your remarks. The question of social protection, another lens, is it's obviously not disconnected to the fiscal capacity or capability of a nation. And according to the ILO, if, for instance, we were to provide a basic level of social security, whatever that may be, according to the ILO, low-income or low-middle-income countries would need to invest about $362 billion per year, which is about 5.1% of their GDP in an aggregate sense, towards which we'll either need to tax more, borrow more, or substitute spending. Is it worth it?
I think the question depends on the definition of social security. The ILO has traditionally emphasized protection. There are valid reasons for doing that, but the gig economy, or all labor markets generally, need to become flexible. So therefore, flexibility automatically implies that rigid notions we have of protection need to be recast in terms of social security, which is not necessarily always provided by the government, but is also provided by the employer and by the employee. But while on this, let me make a slightly different point also, because you mentioned the old and the new. How many people work for the government? And I do not mean government narrowly defined. I mean quasi-government also, which includes university teachers, school teachers, local government, everything. Effectively, people who are part of the broader organized thing, not just the Factories Act. You will find that the figure comes to about 45 million, roughly. Which means, back of the envelope, and these are primarily urban, back of the envelope, 1 in every urban household is earning a living from the government. Against that, that's so to speak the old. Against that, you have the new. In other words, there is a tension between the person who's 45 years old, who, if he loses his job, will no longer be able to retrain himself to get a new job, and you have the young. So there is the old, new, there is this generational tension also, as they ought to be.
And just to also maybe provide another number, I think the Niti Aayog itself has estimated that gig economy workers in India account for about 7.7 million, which is again a fraction of even the large state that you're quantifying. But if I can turn it over now to Fajar, do you see parallels in how policymakers in India are situating the debate with what you see in Indonesia? And is there a way to, is the digital economy really exceptional from your lens? And if so, what does it mean as far as the proportionate responsibility on digital businesses or gig businesses is concerned in the developing country context?
Okay, thank you, Fifan. I think, Mr. Bibek has already explained it very well, about the backgrounds, what's going on nowadays in the global world. And we know that when we are talking about several factors or determinants that, shaping or reshaping our world, I think, there are two main factors which are the demographic change and also the rise of the technology. So when we are talking about, so if I may to share a bit what's going on in Indonesia, I believe that probably it happens in other countries as well when the government seems have no idea how to deal with this, because this is like a new playing field for them. And as we have discussed in the beginning of this conference, Minister Omar, I think, already mentions that it even depends on the form of the government itself, because I believe that Indonesia, also like India, have a decentralized government, and usually there's like a different the local government capacity may differ from one provinces to other provinces. So I believe that we should highlight in this case that we should focus on how to make sure that the government or the ecosystem, in this gig economy, understand well about the sector itself. And I believe that, the talents, how to, let them know, or the recognitions about this sector, I think is also very important. And I believe that when we are talking about the regulation itself, well, of course, I have no background in law. Probably, later on, the other speakers will discuss further about the legal issues, or, from the law perspective. But I think, perhaps, we should promote what's so-called as the self-regulations probably in the futures. And perhaps, it's supposed to be like a bottom-up approach in order to manage or in order to govern this kind of new things or new creatures in the ecosystem.
So Fajar, hold that thought. Let me turn to a lawyer since you gave the prompt yourself. And Neha, if I can bring you in on this question of self-regulation. I think a precursor to all of this is issues around measurement. For instance, in the factory floor era, we came up with this 8-hour concept. Now, 8 hours in, for instance, a creative services setting. For instance, I run a consulting firm. I don't know what 8 hours means for a consultant. Does it mean 4 hours pontificating, reading, and then 4 hours writing? It's very different from sort of maybe even, actually it's unfair to coders. I think probably coders also feel similarly about the coding that they do. Sometimes they have to be creative and not non-mechanical. And that's where the question of measurement comes in. And on the other side of that is questions around surveillance and privacy in the workspace. And just like GDPR and data protection have been flavors of the season over the last decade or so in tech policy, they seem to be spilling over also into the gig economy regulatory conversations that are also heating up around the world. Thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that, Vivan. I think the way you presented it right at the very beginning, right, the lenses that we're using to talk about gig economy have to go beyond just questions of bargaining power and how we're thinking about what kind of benefits we need to extend to workers. Very related are the questions of privacy and surveillance, and I don't necessarily think that in India, at least, we've been asking those questions deeply, if at all. Conversations around what it means for my rights in data as an employee or a gig worker or whatever is the classification that you want to use for this have, I think, been few and far between. But I think it's a very relevant question, right? Because increasingly, it is a tussle between organizations wanting to adopt new metrics of measuring employee performance. And we've seen this be extremely pronounced in the past couple of years of the pandemic even, right? So it's not just in the context of a consultancy organization or a law firm like the kind that you and I run, or a more traditional sort of IT workspace, but really what are the metrics and measurements that we're going to use to measure not just employee performance, employee engagement, and then have benefits that are sort of pegged to this. So if we're asking questions about really what it means for me to be at work today, we're also asking at the same time related questions about, well, you know, maybe do I need to de-link this idea of X number of hours spent at work with the compensation and benefits that I am looking to extend as a result of that work. And the only way to get that kind of data is for companies to be able to get access to different kinds of data. Well, at the same time, you've got very real questions of, well, what is going to happen to this data when it's in my employer's hand? How are you going to really use it? And I don't think we've begun to ask those questions.
So Naina, you're from Bangalore. I overheard, in the speakers lounge, and maybe you can take this to the iSpirit team and ask them to create a stack for intermediating on this question. But more seriously, as far as self-regulation and hard mandate versus soft mandates are concerned, I know you have some thoughts around gender equity, and bringing gender equity into the gig workforce can be done again through some form of self-regulation, self-certification, audit, or it can be through a hard mandate, as you have these CSR mandates and board representation mandates and so on and so forth. Which would work better? And obviously there's a developing country lens that I'd like you to adopt.
Thanks, Vivan. I should clarify, I'm not from Bangalore, so I will not be able to bring in the tech side. So Athira and Neha are, and I'm from here. And well, of course, just to establish the context and the lens of social protection. So a lot of the work that we do at ORF is like a stream of work that we've taken up is around women's workforce participation, and that does include women's labor in the emerging economy. In which case, of course, the gig economy becomes a very important aspect of it. It's touted as a solution to the declining labor force participation crisis that we have in this country, simply because of the fact that it offers the opportunity for flexible time use, which is very important for women in India, where women are just unfairly burdened with domestic work. So with that context, it has not simply lived up to the promise. If we just look at data, we have less than 10% of workers in the gig economy who are women. And why is that? Well, first, we are discussing the future of work and emerging economy, but we also should realize that some of the historic trends, something that you mentioned, Vivan, which belong to traditional work, can also be found in this, which inhibit women from working. Another thing that has to be flagged, if we look at the gender aspect, and we are sitting at a technology conference, is the digital divide that exists. So the latest data for National Family Health Survey will show that 54% of women in the country have their own mobile phones that they can use as opposed to a shared phone, and that becomes a prerequisite to be able to work in the platform economy at all. So there are many gaps that need to be bridged, and to quickly take on your specific question, I think those gaps will be bridged through sensitive policy making and a mix of CSR. Basically, we need every policy approach that can work, and I'll be happy to delve on that in the next round.
Sure. If I can turn over to you, Athira. Companies like yours have been at the center of this debate, and I think there's no escaping the fact that there is a global movement towards social protection, laws, regulation, rulemaking. And this is happening in the EU, the US, and even China after COVID. And the conversation in India too has matured with the Social Security Code and finally some definition to gig work in the country. But is the position that you take as a company, as a multinational company, different in a jurisdiction like India from what you take in the EU vis-a-vis the kinds of social protection that should be provided? And I ask this obviously in the context of the sharp differences between developed and developing country capacities and contexts that we've already seen play out in the panel.
Overall, as a company policy, the fact that the workers who are on our platform should be having access to social security benefit is something that we understand and we are working towards. But it will definitely vary from market to market because the way the workers are working on our platforms are also different. In most of the markets, we have people who might not be taking up driving as a full-time job. Versus in Uber, most of the driver partners we have on a platform are working full-time on our platform. So the way the social security benefits would be designed is definitely different. Most of the other countries already have existing social protection measures that are implemented by the government. And here, with the introduction of Code on Social Security, we are also hoping that these kind of social welfare benefits are accessed by our driver community as well. So just to elaborate on what the existing framework of Code on Social Security looks like is that every platform company should be contributing a particular percentage of their revenue towards something called as a social security fund, from where the gig workers can access maternity benefits, health, life insurance, old age pension, among the host of other benefits that are. But what Uber has always tried to maintain is that, we cannot regulate a gig platform or the gig market the way we have been regulating the traditional companies, right?
But can you do it in the way that you're regulating privacy or antitrust, where there seems to be a homogenization of regulations?
Yeah, so what we are trying to say is that, it has to be principle-based. Any regulation for companies in the new age, companies having newer technology should be principle-based. You cannot be asking a company to abide by regulation where there are A, B, C set of rules to achieve X, Y, Z objective. But it needs to be in a way that the regulation should be more outcome-based, where they say that you can employ whatever tools you have in your existing operating model to ensure that you get to X, Y, Z objective. It cannot be rule-based. See, I'll just because you mentioned some of the other regulations, transport as an industry is heavily regulated, right? So currently in most states, there are rules on aggregator operators where they say that you need to have physical fare meters installed inside a car and ensure that the customers get a paper printout bill. We are in 2022. You don't need a paper printout bill. So it's important that there is much better conversation and trust between the platforms and the government to come up with a model that works for everyone.
Sure. We'll come back on this point. I think there's a lot to unpack. Dr. Debroy, at what scale should a company have to fulfill these responsibilities? And I'm just going back to the initial framing of small versus large. I think we would be doing a disservice to workers, consumers alike, if we are to frame this as a conversation where an Uber or a Ola or a Lyft or a Didi are the ones that are responsible, and then the long tail of any of these gig industries is set aside and differentiated. But at the same time, there is a market entry issue or a competition or a level playing field issue because an Uber or a Ola or a Lyft or a Didi did not have these responsibilities to fulfill as they scaled. Now, as a country which is looking to scale our digital economy to $1 trillion, do we impose those costs? And there are costs on businesses upfront. Do we front load this at this inflection point?
It's a good question, but I think it's a wrong question. And let me explain why I'm saying this. You said rightly, or hinted at the fact rightly, that the union government has combined 50+ union government level statutes into 4, one of which is Social Security. But all of these emanated from the Factories Act. There are plenty of other pieces of legislation floating around on labor, such as the Shops and Establishments Act, which is state-driven, which governs services. But the more fundamental point to ask is the following. What do I want the government to do? By government, I do not mean the executive arm of government. I mean also the legislative wing of government. For instance, do I want a mandatory provident fund that is uniform throughout the country, is uniform at a fixed rate for everyone, as opposed to an individual measurement of productivity-linked incentives, however measured? Or to state it differently, the relationship between an employer and an employee should be in the nature of a bilateral contract, as long as it is voluntary, as long as safety, hazardous processes, those kinds of issues are not violated. The trouble with our historical labor legislation is we've divided it into silos. 10 employees if you use power, 20 employees if you don't use power, and the question you're asking is along those lines. Whatever be the definition of social security should be uniform regardless of size of enterprise, regardless of threshold. Yes, difficult to implement in an economy that's still substantially unorganized. But that's what we need to figure out, whether I'm a domestic worker or whatever I am.
Sure. I think, Fajar, throwing the gauntlet to you now from Dr. Debroy, I think on a related note, if there are indeed, if you don't go for thresholds-based approach, which I agree incentivizes rent-seeking and intervention, and we've seen that in our sort of labor regulations, at least in India. I'm sure Indonesia is not too dissimilar. It then again goes back to the question of self-regulation that you were posing, which is, or maybe co-regulation, wherein there has to be, the state also has to be capacitated to indulge in that co-regulation or take part in it, engage in it with companies. And again, we can talk about the digital exceptionalism here, whether the digital economy allows for itself to be self-regulated better than the traditional economy, and for state capacities to be enhanced quicker perhaps because of regulatory tech and supervisory tech. And there's another related sort of analogy that I'll throw to you, and just you can respond to it as you may, which is that in very complex sectors like finance, you have this co-regulatory model play out in the context of, say, exchanges, where a regulator will say to an exchange, okay, you come up with your bylaws, and we will oversee that you are indeed sticking to the laws that you've made. And so in a competitive marketplace, employees, for instance, can choose among gig businesses that offer a certain terms, and they are co-regulated on those terms by the state. Is that a sort of model that Indonesia or other developing countries should explore? Just thoughts.
Thank you, Fifan. Well, I think the main message that I also want to make in this conference, I think, like when we are talking about gig economy, I think we cannot really produce such a, like one-fits-all policy, because I believe that, different sectors have a different characteristics. And I believe that, the way why I'm proposing what's so-called as a self-regulation, because I believe that, in this new era, I can say that, the one who understands about the sector is the industry or the player itself. And I know that sometimes, well, of course, Indonesia, in this case, also have a, a strong, government have a strong or significant role in this, playing field. But again, so that's why it will be better, I know that the issues of the social protections or the social security, I think it's a must, it's a mandatory.
What is the history of labor unions in Indonesia?
Sorry?
What is the history of labor unions in Indonesia, and how does it intersect with what you're saying?
Well, I think, Dr. Debroy also mentions about the bargaining powers about the between the unions and the employers. And I believe that, in that case, we also now is dealing with the issues of the minimum wage law, for example, because we have a diverse, we have a 34 provinces, and then we are, having a different minimum wage law, even though we already have a presidential regulation in order to make sure that the increase of the minimum wage in all provinces have within the range. So the idea here basically, the omnibus law itself, we have a job creation law that trying to deal with the new a model of the business, trying to attract more investors, but unfortunately the Supreme Court nowadays just suspended the laws, and then it seems that the issues of law itself, the issue of the regulation itself, probably not only in Indonesia but also in other countries also, have a a very important issue that we have to solve together. Because again, back to the my points about how to make this kind of the good regulation. At least we know that there's a necessities there, there's a transparencies there, and then the proportionality, the effectiveness, and also the flexibility, because I believe that this kind of gig economy will change over time, and I think we should have a flexibilities on that.
Yeah. No, on that point, Neha, on flexibility as a principle, and many of the others again echoed privacy principles and general principles that we talk about in the context of internet regulation. What role do courts have to play in this sort of setting of these principles? India has seen a few cases around the gig economy versus policy makers, lawmakers, and so on and so forth. And how do you really begin to codify principles like flexibility? And I think it's on both sides, supply side, demand side. For instance, on the supply side, as Fajar mentioned, a gig platform can be it can have different functions. There can be a lot of different kinds of actors on that platform. And then the problems around classification begin, and sort of inclusion, exclusion errors, and so on, which we will talk about later on. But just, how do you operationalize some of these principles? Because as opposed to privacy, where you can sort of maybe envision them now, I don't know if we're close to envisioning them as lawyers or policy communities across the world.
Yeah, I think the answer to the second question first, just to echo some of the other thoughts on the panel.
It's close to the
Is
mic.
it not on? Hello? Better? I think the answer to the second part, or the second set of questions first, to echo some of the other speakers on the panel, me personally, we've strongly always advocated for self-regulation and co-regulation when it came to digital economy businesses generally, because I do think that there is a lot more flexibility and fluidity there, specifically even in the context of the various models of gig work that we see around us today, right? One platform is not the same as another, and you cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to, say if I as a worker or I as a professional spend 2 hours on a particular kind of platform to supplement my income when I'm otherwise offering services in other contexts, versus where I have the opportunity to spend 10 to 12 hours on a particular platform, which for all intents and purposes is in effect my full-time job, right? You're breaking down then what fundamentally philosophically work means. The nature of work is different, and then therefore the kind of benefits that you're associating with that kind of work, whether it's monetary, whether in terms of how much money you're making home, or whether it's a whole bunch of these other benefits that you're taking aside. And I honestly think that the first step to that is to think about first principles models, right, which evolve only.
So as a first principle, let me press you on that.
Sure.
The US is applying a different first principle for qualifying a gig worker than the EU.
Sure.
As far as I can understand. The US has, under Biden, gone back to an Obama-era understanding, which is that if your incomes are dependent on a platform significantly, then you kind of are classified as a gig worker, entitled to certain social protections. In the EU, it's slightly different. There, the notion of gig work is associated with the amount of control the platform exercises over your day-to-day operations.
Yeah.
Which would you prescribe in the Indian context, or is this a debate that you feel needs to be had with other communities first?
So I think I think it's the latter, but I also think that there is a little bit of sort of historical legal context that we can't really walk away from, right? In India, we've looked at concepts of independent contractor and employee in a certain way. To go back to your first question on really what role do the courts play, the courts have already played a role, but I don't think fundamentally in policy making courts should be the ones that are setting policy for us, right? That has to come from the legislature, and then questions of interpretation is what you take to courts. But we already have a history here which in some senses I don't think we can walk away from, right? And in India, the understanding of what constitutes an employee versus who is an independent contractor depends on many different factors, but key among them is the kind of control and the degree of control that your employer will exercise on the employee, right? But again, that becomes a question of fact and circumstance. There is no one size fits all where I can tell you these are the 5 criteria. If you sort of check mark, this is when I can sort of tell you that A is exercising control over B. Part of that is the ability to hire and fire, but it's so much more than that, which the court also recognizes. It says there are these 5 different things and you do need to look at it sort of holistically. So I suppose it's closer in some senses to what we're seeing coming out of the European Union. That's really where Indian sort of law will lead us.
Sure. No, that's very helpful. And turning it back to you, Sunaina, and you know, it remains an unresolved kernel of an idea in my head, which is that with flexible time use and with the fact that, you know, contrary to perhaps a lot of conventional wisdom on labor force participation, I am sure, as you are, that women exercise much more agency than we get them credit for, and we've done some work around this. Why is it that they are not actually participating more in the gig economy here? Do you think it's a structural issue? So the digital divide on one hand, of course, is a given. But is there also some sort of a structural issue or a rigidity or a distortion or a mismatch in incentives or something like that as far as the, you know, the industry is concerned, the people who are hiring and contracting women, you know? And have you looked at this across different kinds of industries within the digital space, digital gig economy space, for instance? I mean, it's a fact that there are security concerns with women cabbies, right? And then you have a very heightened degree of responsibility as a platform for, you know, security. But maybe not the case as far as services are concerned, you know, the kinds that maybe a platform like Urban Company may offer. Many of those beauticians, et cetera, are inherently sort of lend themselves to greater female participation. Do you see this kind of heterogeneity across platforms, or is it some sort of a secular trend that then it's very worrying indeed, and you know, we need to solve for it immediately? I think
we were having a conversation on this outside, and she was talking about the Uber experience. But before I do that, and I know that you also have done a pretty interesting study on women and platform workers. So I think the why of it is, of course, pretty complicated, but there are some things that we see. You just mentioned Urban Company, right? And what we constantly see is the occupational segregation that shows up where women are relegated to certain jobs, whether it is beauty, health, all of that. And within that, though there isn't enough research, and that's another gap that we find that we definitely need to find out what are women's experiences in the platform economy. But what shows up is that this whole idea of flexibility has actually, it has been effective, at least in cities where women take part in platform work. I think one study found that 80% of those women were married and with children. And what that work gave to them was, of course, just autonomy. Some of them were prime earners in their home. It brought them bargaining power within the household. And you know, that brings us back to what has been the framing of this argument, which is the need for social protection, which, of course, Dr. Debroy spoke very eloquently about. And the fact that when we talk about occupational segregation and we just had the pandemic, the women who were working in these sectors, which are high-touch sectors, were the ones who were left without a job during those 2 years of the pandemic. So, and this is where the need for perhaps addressing questions like minimum earnings, where we look at the social, at the new labor code, which does not address the question of minimum wage. It leaves platform workers out of that. And I think that, especially for women, becomes a very important aspect, but also for all platform workers, for that matter, where we look at the question of equal pay, minimum pay, and how that can be brought in. And to go back to the existential question of why this is happening, I think it's just so many factors together. It is historic factors which continue to inhibit women, and I think Athira will be able to talk about it from her experience at Uber, and I think it is also how the future of work is leaving women out.
Also, I think global labor statistics show it's getting worse after COVID, so it's the inequity is getting worse, even in terms of participation. So yes. I don't think India is an outlier on that front.
It isn't.
But Athira, you know, I don't like to do this, but using a deductive logic rationale here. You know, when I talk to, and as all of us tend to do, we get our worldview from taxi drivers. They don't really seem to be concerned with questions around around social protection in the wider sense of insurance and so on and so forth, as much as they are concerned about the way platforms treat workers, by which I mean instances of microaggression between handlers and drivers or any gig workers, or issues around resolution of complaints and grievance redressal. Yeah. How does a deplatformed, quote-unquote, driver get access to justice in your private world? Yeah. How do you as a company address these issues, and do you feel like they should take precedence over the social protection conversation in the wider sense, given that perhaps or do you see this sort of reflected in your conversations with drivers? Do they prioritize things other than what we think they ought to prioritize?
Yeah. I'll just take a leaf from the conversation Sunena was having, first related to gender. For past close to 7 years, we've been trying to onboard more women and trans persons onto our platform. So initially when we had Uber Eats, the platform was much more easier for more trans persons to join and earn a livelihood. But post-COVID, there has been a huge drop of women from our platform. So we've been doing a lot of focus group discussions with women who have joined our platform and then left, with women who initially signed up but never even tried to join our platform. And a couple of things that emerged. One is access to asset. They do not understand from where they can buy a car, the collateral that needs to be given to get a car, the initial amount that they need to deposit. All those becomes very difficult. So then we try to design a model in a way that we will match them. So initially when they got a car, they did not have provision to park their car. So they are living in places where they do not have enough infrastructure to have a parking space. Even if they get a parking space, most of the time they come back to us and say that in a fit of fury, sometimes their alcoholic husband has destroyed the car, saying that the reason why they are rebelling against them is because now they have an access to livelihood. So there's a lot of factors that impact women from driving on our platforms. Another one is with regard to the timings. Most of our peak travel happens from say 8 to 10 and then from 4 to 6. During these hours, women are not able to get out of the house because they have other duties that the society has pushed onto them. So whatever balance hours that they get to drive, they are not able to earn enough, which when we understood this, we tried to design a better incentive structure for them. So it's been a trial and error method, but I will be very honest to say that we have not been able to onboard the number of women that we wanted to initially. It was an ambitious project, but sure, it's far from getting there. To the other question, we've been having conversations with our driver partners across the country, and most importantly, what they require, what they're expecting from customers, from company is respect, that they are dealt with respect. When there is a complaint by a rider against a driver, they want the platform to hear their side as well. Because most of the time, for companies, customers, the rider, be it for Uber, it's rider.
So abstracting away from your platform, how do you institutionalize the provision of respect in gig work in India?
So one is the review system, right? So currently, all platforms have a two-way review system where the workers are also able to review the users on how they are treated. So ideally, every platform should take these reviews very seriously and ensure that if there is a particular user who's consistently rated low, they should not be allowed to use the platform at least for a considerable period of time. At Uber, how we try and understand the problems that the drivers are facing is also through something that we recently set up, which is a driver advisory council. We have, through a rigorous interview process, we have selected 35 drivers from across the country. And there is an independent organization, APTI, which is a think tank that works extensively on gig work. They facilitate this discussion where every quarter they meet and try and understand what the drivers want from the company.
And you have a report card of what you acted on and what you didn't act on and why?
Yes. So we basically, it's all driven through the independent organization so that there is no bias that creeps into it. So there will be list of, we already have an agenda on what gets discussed, which is primarily driven by the driver community. And then we discuss it, and then we take it back to the company where we all huddle and understand which are the things that we can take up and immediately come up with solution and which requires long-term work. And then we circle back to the driver community and talk to them about what are the solutions we have come up with. So this has been working well so far. And this is the same platform we try and talk to them about the code on social security and why even among the driver community, they need to ask for the COSs to be notified as soon as possible.
Sure. Dr. Debroy, since we're running out of time, maybe you can try to draw some conclusions from this discussion, and we can do a quick round with the rest as well. But broadly, what we've heard today, states don't necessarily have the capacity to do rule making on the fine print of what is a digital business, what nature a digital business is, what are the functional differences, how do workers sort of interact with it. A lot of it, therefore, engenders the need for some level of self or co-regulation. And you have proposed that we do away with thresholds. We throw out the old entirely, the old constructs of creating arbitrary thresholds, which I think a lot of us would be in favor of, but it is debatable whether that will have an impact from a comparative advantage standpoint on digital market growth in India and digital product penetration in other markets. That's something we can perhaps reserve for another conversation. But taking from what you've heard, I think one of the key issues here is also the inclusion-exclusion issue, which we've sort of touched on as well. On what basis do you include people? And there's this whole contention that there's a lot of self-employment which gets double counted or remains uncounted in gig work and so on and so forth, depending on which side of the aisle you are. How do you reconcile all of this as a state which will need to think about actually every aspect of digital regulation as you address labor regulation? You'll need to think about different aspects of legacy regulations as you address this challenge. Are states up to it, or does the wisdom need to come from outside? How does this work?
It's not a question of whether the states are up to it. I think it's more a question of whether we as a collective entity are up to it, reflected in some of the discussion and reflected in our mindsets, which indirectly in an indirect democracy gets reflected in what happens to Parliament. My simple proposition is the following. If it's a contract amongst equals, why do I want government, not just the executive, to dabble? If you're going to compensate me, why should there be a weekly holidays act? If you compensate me for working on a Sunday, why should I have that? Why should I have a Shops and Establishments Act in Delhi which says this side of the Najafgarh drain, the shops must be open on that day and on that side on some other day? So the mindset as a collective entity is of how much of government intervention we want. And I don't think as a legacy we've given that up. Second point, I hate differences. This is precisely what we did earlier, Plantation Labours Act something, working journalists something. We don't want it. We want to unify. No, nothing special for gig, nothing special for digital. We haven't yet unified. We haven't yet unified because as a collective entity, we are still not clear in our minds that we want that unification. And until we want that unification, the ease of doing business so far as employment and labor laws is concerned will never come down.
Neha, Fajr, and Sunaina, if you'd like to add anything just by way of concluding remarks and relieve me of the responsibility, please go ahead.
I don't know if I have anything to add really, but I echo a lot of there's just been generally, I think, some degree of alignment on the panel in terms of how we're thinking about the role of the state or the lack thereof. And I do think that there is, I really liked how you began when you came to me, right? It's not just a question of questions that we're asking on compensation and bargaining power. I do think that the issues that we need to look at go well beyond that. And the only way to do that is to have this kind of collective dialogue and regulatory mechanisms that go well beyond just state-sanctioned, state-enforced regulation.
Okay, if I may to add, well, I can say that when we are talking about this gig economy, well, I think we already know the big elephant in the rooms, and sometimes, it's quite difficult in order to, to assess the defaults in the details. But again, in my opinions, talking about this gig economy, I think we have heard in this conference as well, there are many regulatory sandboxes that, might be relevant in order to test the business model itself. And then I believe that from the perspective of Indonesia, when we are dealing with its ride-hailing sectors at the time, the players usually, they prefer to apologizing first and then asking a permission after that, so that's why, it's sometimes that we know that we are dealing with this new playing field, and I believe that, again, about the flexibility that I think is supposed to be, highlighted in these things. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So very quickly, I would say that we are talking about a new economy, and as everyone has acknowledged, that the policy making has to be flexible. It also has to be responsive, and for women, I think some documents which are coming out on the platform economy still look at them from the inclusion lens, as opposed to active participants with huge potential to contribute to the economy. So that itself needs to change.
Thank you. I think as COVID has done, it's prompted us to question a lot of existing traditional modes of doing business and regulating. I think the gig economy is forcing us to rethink labor regulations overall. And it's not a question of same service, same rules. It's a question of, are the rules appropriate? And if they are appropriate, you can apply them uniformly, as Dr. Debroy says. So thank you very much, everybody, for doing this today. Thank you.